Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the man you just saw, the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the president's action, the attorney general has resigned. Elliot Richardson, who was appointed attorney general only last May in the midst of the Watergate scandals, has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions.
Good morning and welcome back to AM Joy. What you just saw was an NBC special report from October 20th, 1973, at a moment when the United States faced a genuine constitutional crisis. Republican President Richard Nixon tried to throw a wrench into the Watergate investigation by firing the man in charge of that investigation, a decision both his attorney general and deputy attorney general resigned over. A series of events dubbed the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon eventually shut down the special prosecutor's office entirely and ultimately, of course, resigned the presidency. This week, during the tumultuous dawn of the Trump presidency, we saw history kind of repeat itself.
We had a Monday night massacre. Sally Yates, a person of great integrity who follows the law, was fired by the president. She was fired because she would not pursue the executive order on the belief that it was illegal, perhaps unconstitutional. Sally Yates was a profile in courage.
Donald Trump fired acting Attorney General Sally Yates on Monday after she refused, as you just heard, to enforce that executive order barring immigrants from 7 majority Muslim countries and refugees from around the world from coming to the United States. And joining me now is Mark Alexander, Dean of Villanova Law School, Ryan Riley, Justice reporter at the Huffington Post, Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics lawyer, and John Dean, former White House counsel to Richard Nixon and author of Conservatives Without Conscience. And John Dean, I have to start with you on this because that story is sort of striking. I love watching that old John Chancellor news broadcast from October of 1972. The sort of interesting irony is that after the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General wouldn't fire Archibald Cox, one Robert Bork did it. So he turns up again later in history. Do you think that it is fair to sort of make this comparison between the Saturday Night Massacre back then and this Monday Night Massacre of Donald Trump?
Well, I think there is a good loose comparison. There's a style comparison. While the underlying circumstances were different during the Saturday Night Massacre as opposed to the Monday Night Massacre, the style with which they did it were not dissimilar, where the president gave an order to just fire the person who wouldn't do what he wanted and didn't want to even talk about it. I remember well when Carl Stern of NBC News actually interrupted live programming to come on and announce the fact that Cox had been fired. So it wasn't quite as dramatic this time as it was then, but Trump is showing true Nixonian style in the way he's done it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to read a little bit for Richard Painter of the memo that acting Attorney General Sally Yates, and she of course is acting Attorney General because there is no confirmed AG yet. This is the letter she sent to the top lawyers at the Justice Department on Monday, but which got her fired. She said it's her solemn obligation to always seek justice and stand for what is right. She essentially said, and this is the next clip, for as long as I am the acting Attorney General, the Department of Justice will not present arguments in defense of the executive order unless and until I become convinced it's appropriate to do so. So you essentially Richard Painter had her saying that she didn't think the executive order was lawful. Now that we've had 2 federal judges suspend, at least temporarily, that order, meaning that they think that there is a chance, a good chance, that those saying it's unlawful would prevail, is she now vindicated?
Well, I think she's vindicated by the fact that over the past 2 weeks, we've seen a betrayal of what our Constitution provides with respect to the executive power of the president and a violation of fundamental constitutional rights. I have students who can't fly home to visit their families can't visit them here. And I ask why, and the only explanation I can give is their country's too poor to have a Trump hotel. I mean, there is no rational basis for this executive order. It was premised on religious discrimination. It's very clear that the president is acting unconstitutionally. It's the job of the Attorney General to stand up to that. And that's what she did, and she was fired for it. I think that the Trump administration needs to be held accountable for that.
And Ryan Riley, you just heard Richard Painter make an allusion to the emoluments clause, which has sort of fallen out of the verbiage of the news media when it comes to Donald Trump. But there is a very glaring point here, which is that none of the 7 countries that were barred from having their migrants come to the United States are places where Donald Trump does business. But a lot of big countries that have histories of actually sending some of their citizens to commit terrorism against Americans, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, they're not on the list, and it includes some countries where Donald Trump does business. Is there any buzz on Capitol Hill that finally Republicans might want to do something about that, or at least say something about it?
Not that we've seen so far, but I think what's interesting is, you look at with the Yates situation, and I had one ally of hers sort of explain it to me. If you compare it to the situation in North Carolina with the voting ID law there, and if you were to look at the face of it, just on its face, you might be able to say, okay, this isn't discriminatory. But if you look at the purpose behind it and some of the language that the people behind it use, just as in North Carolina, you can really see what this is all about. So I think that's ultimately what Yates was doing here, and we've noticed she's done no media ever since this happened. And I think this is really, and for the attack that the White House made on her, I think was sort of extraordinary, given that she's this longtime federal prosecutor who's worked for so so long for the Department of Justice, and then to see this sort of very political attack on her, I think was very surprising. And certainly the firing, I think, came as somewhat as a surprise to her and a lot of her allies as well.
And let me play, Mark, for you her confirmation hearing, Sally Yates' confirmation hearing to be Deputy Attorney General back in 2015. And this is one Jeff Sessions grilling her about her responsibilities under then President Barack Obama. Should he require her, ironically enough, to execute unlawful orders? Take a listen.
You have to watch out, because people will be asking you to do things you just need to say no about. Do you think the Attorney General has a responsibility to say no to the President if he asks for something that's improper?
The Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General has an obligation to follow the law and the Constitution and to give their independent legal advice to the President.
So, Mark, she got fired for doing that,
right?
For following Jeff Sessions' advice.
She was absolutely right that she has to exercise independent judgment. This is the person who is the people's lawyer. She doesn't represent the president per se, and that's what's very important. And it is an irony now that we have Jeff Sessions making this point, and we certainly can hope that whatever the issue is, that the Attorney General, whoever it is, will exercise independent judgment, because that is essential. And that's what we saw, and it is an ironic situation looking back to what happened during Watergate to what happened now, something which doesn't reflect well on us as a nation.
And John Dean, last night when this breaking news sort of broke that the federal judge in Seattle had issued a stay of this executive order, we were literally having conversations on this network and others about what would happen if the White House decided not to follow the order, to defy the federal judge. That is another sense in which we are entering sort of Nixonian territory. Should we be genuinely concerned that this administration will simply ignore federal judges' orders, especially since the president disparaged the judge as a so-called judge on his Twitter feed this morning?
Well, there's no doubt we need to be worried about that. It would create a constitutional crisis if the president refused to follow the order. It appears this morning that he indeed is going to follow it. When Nixon was forced to turn over his tapes, the real question was whether he would follow the Supreme Court's directive in that instance. And maybe one of his finer moments was what indeed he did, because you've got to remember the president has the troops and the courts have the U.S. Marshals. It's not really a fair match.
Yeah, and to stay with you for just a moment, John Dean, I've read that the 2 gentlemen that resigned rather than fire Archibald Cox later expressed a sort of relief that Robert Bork went ahead and did it, because after him, he was the Solicitor General. There was really no one else who could have carried out that order. You would have had a crisis in that there would have been a sort of constitutional sort of vacuum had there been nobody willing to do what the president said. Do you agree with that?
I've talked to Bill Ruckklaus about it. No question that they encouraged him to do so. They wanted him to follow up. As I said, we've made an arrangement and a promise to the Senate Judiciary Committee when we were confirmed that we wouldn't remove the special prosecutor excepting for cause. And to honor that word, then that principle, they indeed held forth and steady on their position. But they did encourage Bork to do the deed, because it did get very complex after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And apparently he was offered a Supreme Court seat if he would do it by the president. So lots of fascinating stuff there. But Richard Painter, I want to come back to the point you made, because I don't want it to be missed, that you do have, as a part of this executive order, the exclusion of countries where Donald Trump does business. We come right back again to this emoluments clause problem. Could that order be made unlawful, including by the fact that it excluded countries where the president has a pecuniary interest?
Absolutely. This order has no rational basis whatsoever other than a veiled attempt to discriminate against Muslims and also discriminate against those countries where the president does not do business. And the broader point is that these officials from the president on down are sworn to uphold the Constitution. They are ignoring it. They go to a prayer breakfast and invoke the name of God, and yet repeatedly violate God's word in how he wants us to treat our fellow human beings. And somebody needs to stand up to it. The acting attorney general did, and the rest of us need to, before we end up with a catastrophe on our hands.
And Ryan Riley, I guess that brings us to the point of where are the Republicans? Why are they, we don't seem to see, other than staff, you seem to have sort of a revolt of the civil servants with all of these rogue Twitter accounts at the National Park Service, with this Deputy Attorney General, but there doesn't seem to be much interest among Republicans, elected Republicans, of doing anything to even slow down Donald Trump. Why is that?
You know, it's tough to say right now. I mean, you had Ted Cruz essentially come out and attack the now former acting attorney general for not sort of defending this law. And what they've sort of gone back to is saying that, you know, basically Sessions should have been confirmed. But I think that's also an interesting point here, because, I mean, on a lot of major issues, essentially what Yates and her supporters and allies within the Justice Department were doing in a lot of these cases, working with the new Trump administration, was putting a lot of things on hold and essentially saying, we're going to wait this out until, you know, Sessions is confirmed, and then we're going to go forward. But the White House, in going forward with this in sort of this disorganized manner that we've seen, you know, unfold throughout the country, sort of put her in a corner and forced her to make this choice. And it was ultimately one that, you know, she decided not to resign over. That was sort of what it came down to: resignation. Or essentially whether she was going to be, you know, ordered to do this and then have to resign, or whether she would want to defy the president. And I think that, you know, that was something that she didn't sort of expect going into this, but that's what ended up happening.
And then what happened, Mark, is that you had the spokesman for the president call her a traitor, say she had betrayed the Department of Justice, and then went on to say she's weak on borders and very weak on illegal immigration, a very Trumpian statement, and not what you typically hear from a White House, from a president.
Right. It's beneath the White House. The White House shouldn't be saying that there's a so-called judge, shouldn't say somebody is weak, shouldn't be doing these kinds of things, shouldn't be talking about somebody's TV ratings. That's beneath the office of the president, and that's the challenge. When you're talking your first 100 days, not even, and you've got these first 14 days, and you've got the potential of constitutional crisis and this kind of stuff. This is beneath the office, and certainly we can hope that there's better, but we'll have to see what comes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark Alexander, Ryan Riley, Richard Painter, and John Dean. Great panel. Thank you, guys.